Alright, welcome everyone to our second lecture on the American Civil War. We're going to deal with the Western and Trans-Mississippi theaters. This one will be a little bit quicker than the Eastern theater lecture, so I'm sorry about how long they are, but here we go. So looking at the early stages in the West, the main goal of the Union was to make sure that Missouri and Kentucky did not secede and go to the Southern cause. They were successful in doing that. Now, although the South didn't get those two states, their forces were commanded by Albert Sidney Johnston in the West, and he was able to consolidate his power and get his forces together, which was important for him because it gave him a powerful striking force in the Western theater. Now, the Union forces, although they were successful in keeping Missouri and Kentucky, they weren't unified. They were actually fairly divided. They attacked in different directions. They did achieve some victories, but they were very minor and not very significant, and they were very, very slow to move and attack Johnston or any other Confederate forces. So to move further, the first significant battles in the Western theater were at Forts Henry and Fort Donelson. And at Fort Henry, a majority of the Confederate forces were actually withdrawn because the fort was in an untenable position where there's high ground actually overlooking it, and enemy cannons could actually fire into the fort. Plus, it was partially flooded and so forth. It was in bad shape. So forces under General Grant, including infantry and gunboats, actually attacked the fort. It was very quick and easy for Grant to actually achieve that victory because of the state of the fort and the fact that most of the defenders had been withdrawn. Now, a few days later, Grant did attack the other fort on the Mississippi, known as Fort Donelson, and this is where it was a significant event, not just in importance in terms of the victory for the North, but also because of the casualties. The fort's guns laid heavy damage to Union gunboats. The Confederates tried to launch an escape attempt, but it failed, and then the fort surrendered actually the next day from after their escape attempt. But these two forts being in the hands of the Union were important. One, it opened up the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. Sorry, I think I said that they were on the Mississippi. That's my bad. And at least most of the Tennessee River to the Union, which allowed for better transportation of supplies and troops for the Union, but also prevented the South from doing the same. But it also elevated the career of General Grant, who's going to become much more important as the war progresses in both the Western and Eastern theaters. Now on to Shiloh. This is the first real significant engagement in the Western theater. It happened in early April of 1862, and really how it started is Grant's forces were surprised. They were attacked. They weren't ready by a combined set of Confederate forces under Pierre Beauregard, who was the commander at Fort Sumter, and Albert Sidney Johnston, and they were attacked at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. Now, Union forces, they suffered heavy casualties. They retreated very quickly, except for a set of men who held up in an area known as the Hornet's Nest. It was known as the Hornet's Nest because of how fierce the fighting was there. Now, they were overrun, but they delayed the Confederate attack just long enough for reinforcements to hold the line along Pittsburgh Landing, which was near the Tennessee River. Now, in this attack, it was important that General Johnston for the South was mortally wounded, and you can see Johnston there in the lower picture holding the cup up in the air. And the next day, Grant, with his reinforcements from General Buell, actually drives the Confederates back and achieves a Union victory, despite the heavy casualties. And he's going to get a lot of criticism for this in this action. And just a little side note, there were more casualties in this battle alone than all other previous American battle casualties combined in their previous wars. Alright, next, the Battle of New Orleans. This is a quick one. The Battle of New Orleans was very important, as New Orleans was one of the most important ports for the South. Matter of fact, I believe it was their biggest port. And the city was protected at the mouth of the Mississippi River by a series of forts. Now, what happened was the Union Navy, their commander decided in late April to run the gauntlet. So basically just sail his ships while firing past the forts and get up between the river and past them. He's able to actually do that and get into the Confederate ships and destroys them. And he quickly captures the port of New Orleans. Now this is important because not only does it mean that the South loses a significant port, but it also means that now the Union controls the access point into the Mississippi River. So that, even though they don't have control of the entire Mississippi yet, they have control of the in and out point of the river itself. All right, now let's move on to Corinth, Mississippi. Now this is after Shiloh. The Confederate forces, they actually withdraw to the south into Corinth, Mississippi, which is to the north. It's a very important town because it's a vital railroad hub. Now what happens is Beauregard actually withdraws from the city, angers his superiors, and the Union actually move into the town. Now Grant tells his commander there, you need to build defenses because they'll be back. It's important because they come back. And Confederates under Earl Van Dorn actually attack the prepared defenses. They're initially successful, but they're repulsed with by heavy casualties. Now the Union victory is important, and there's going to be another battle at Corinth, and the Union are going to win again because it gives them a vital transportation hub. Now you're going to see a common theme in the Western theater that holding areas for transportation purposes are going to be the most important. It's going to be much more fluid, and the combat's going to take place over a wide range of areas, unlike where most of the battles were fought in basically the same places in Virginia in the Eastern Theater. All right, the next battle, we're going to go to Kentucky. It was known as Perryville. General Braxton Bragg was the new commander. He plans to invade Kentucky to try to bring them into the Union. Not really successful. He doesn't really have much luck. But in October of 1862, his forces meet Union forces at Perryville because both sides were looking for water. They were desperate to replenish their water supply. Now the Confederates, although they're really outnumbered, they go on the attack. They push the Union forces back. They catch them off guard. The Union forces, kind of like we've talked about at Corinth and really at Shiloh, stabilize themselves. They counterattack, and they stem Bragg's attack. Now, this is when the Union forces start to consolidate themselves. Bragg realizes he's outnumbered, so he withdraws under the cover of darkness to fight another day. Now, furthermore, in other actions, the war takes itself really to Tennessee, and the Union seizes the town of Nashville, which is an important city in Tennessee, logistically and politically as well. Now, Bragg realizes that he has to take it back, or at least gain some kind of control, and he launches an attack at a place called Stone's River. Again, he catches the Union forces by surprise, and just like we've talked about, it sounds like a broken record, they regroup and stand their ground. Okay, now, the fighting actually takes place on December 31st and New Year's Day, and really, there's not so much on New Year's Day. There's kind of just little sporadic fighting here and there, but then Bragg renews his attack after thinking about leaving the next day. That's repulsed, and he withdraws. Now, this effect is important because it gives the Union a morale boost after, in the East, they had just suffered that really terrible defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So it's a big morale boost for the Northern cause. All right, as you guys can see from our previous lecture, okay, the Union really at this time is losing in the East, but they're winning in the West. Okay, now on to Vicksburg. This is going to be the deciding campaign that we're going to combine with Gettysburg. Now, Vicksburg, Mississippi, at this point in the war, was really the last important city that the South controlled on the Mississippi River between Memphis and New Orleans. And really, if it falls, the Union has complete control of the Mississippi River, and the Confederacy is effectively split in two. All right, so initial attempts by the Union to actually take the city fail due to its positions, the forts, and the guns that are outside of it. One example is Grant actually undergoes trials to dig canals to circumnavigate the city's defenses by basically changing the path of the Mississippi. They don't work. But on May 14th of 1863, Grant decides he's going to go into Mississippi, and he attacks Jackson, Mississippi, the capital, seizes it and essentially isolates Vicksburg, because that's really their main land connection into the rest of the South. And then he begins attacking westward. Now, at the Battle of Champions Hill, the commander of Vicksburg actually came out to meet Grant's armies. He tries to break out and defeat Grant there. It fails, and this is when the siege of Vicksburg gets underway. Now, at the battle at Vicksburg itself, it's completely isolated. It's under siege, but they have prepared defenses. It's reason why the city has not fallen yet. Now, the Union attacks fail miserably. There's heavy casualties, but Grant, as he's known, or what he's going to become known for, is he continues to press the attack despite all the men that are dying or being wounded. There are actually 2 occasions where Union forces actually detonate mines underneath the Confederate defenses. This first one fails. The second one doesn't. They damage them severely. And then just a few days later, on July 4th of 1863, Vicksburg surrenders. So you have, with the effects of this, the Union gains control of the Mississippi and the Confederate States are split in 2. But when you combine it with the fact that Union forces just the day before in the Eastern Theater were victorious at the Battle of Gettysburg, this is the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Pretty much after this point, there's no chance they can really win, unless they can bring Lincoln to the negotiation table and strike a deal. So you have the Battle of Vicksburg and the Battle of Gettysburg here, changing things in early July of 1863. All right, now let's move to Chickamauga. We're going to go back to General Bragg. Now he is outnumbered. He withdraws from Tennessee into Georgia, basically because of his position just wasn't untenable and him moving. Now Rosecrans, who was the Union Army commander at the time, rushes after Bragg. He actually goes too quick, and the reason why is because Lee sends Longstreet, one of his best and capable commanders, his corps, from the Eastern Theater by rail to Bragg, and that switches the numbers in favor of the Confederacy at this point in the war in this section of our country. And what happens is Rosecrans doesn't realize it quick enough, and Longstreet hits his lines at a gap and forces a retreat. But one man, George H. Thomas, who's going to get the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga, you can see him down in the lower picture, takes his corps and his troops stand firm for a significant amount of time and prevents the Union forces from routing and prevents the destruction of the Union Army. Now, what happens is Rosecrans decides, all right, we've been defeated. He's going to withdraw his army back into Tennessee, into this town of Chattanooga. And Bragg, he's still outnumbering Rosecrans, which is one of the few times the South actually outnumbers the North in the war, lays siege to the city. Now, what happens is Grant comes to the aid of Rosecrans because Vicksburg's over. He replaces Rosecrans with Thomas because he sees that Thomas is a much more effective commander. So in late November, Grant actually attacks Bragg. Now, Bragg's forces have been whittled down because of another attack on Knoxville, Tennessee, but we'll get to that here shortly. And Grant has his forces attack in 2 places. His troops under Hooker, who we've talked about at Antietam and in Chancellorsville, who's now in a command in the west, takes Lookout Mountain on the 25th of November, the second day of the attack. Now, the following day, Thomas, who was besieged in the city of Chattanooga, but now the Union forces outnumber who they're going against, takes Missionary Ridge, and effectively basically makes the entire position of Bragg untenable, and Chattanooga is saved, and Bragg retreats back into Georgia again. Now, on to Knoxville. In September of 1863, while all this stuff is going on with Chickamauga, Union forces under Ambrose Burnside, who now has another command, and we talked about him in the last lecture, takes the city of Knoxville. Well, after Chickamauga, Bragg sends Longstreet, who was a who criticized Bragg, to retake the city. Well, Burnside's not stupid. He realizes he's going to, well, at least in this case, he's not stupid. He withdraws to prepare defenses, and Over a month or two, Longstreet issues several attacks, and they fail. And actually, he ends up really withdrawing because of the Confederate defeat at Chattanooga. Means that he really can't stay in the position that he's in. Now, for all intents and purposes, these victories for the Union at Chattanooga and Knoxville are important because it opens the road to Atlanta to be attacked by Union forces. Now, let's switch gears here to the Trans-Mississippi Theater, which means it's west of the Mississippi. Over really a 2 to 3 month period from March to May of 1864, there's a Union campaign in Louisiana with the goals to seize Shreveport, Louisiana, which is an important port city along the Mississippi, and eastern Texas, because the Union really hadn't went into Texas. But they wanted to do this to also stop foreign aid coming from Mexico, as well as seize any cotton stores to help hurt the southern economy. Now, this campaign was commanded by Nathaniel Banks. He moved very slowly. The Confederates actually delay the Union advance, even defeat Banks in a couple of instances, and Banks ends up withdrawing back to New Orleans. And this is important because it makes sure that Texas and western Louisiana are going to stay in the hands of the Confederacy. Now, Mobile Bay moved to the south along the Gulf Coast. By 1864, really the only port on the Gulf of Mexico that the Confederates still had the ability to send stuff out of with using blockade runners was in Mobile, Alabama, and that was because of the city's defenses. But on August 5th of 1864, Rear Admiral David Farragut, the Union commander of the Navy in that area, was very bold and sails his ships up the defenses and past them into the bay. And he gets out of gun range of the forts and attacks the Confederate Navy. And when he does that, they're actually very successful, sinking all but one of the ships. Then they immobilize the last remaining Confederate naval vessel, and the commander decides to surrender the city to Farragut, and that means that Mobile Bay, or the city of Mobile, is going to be in the hands of the Union, and this completes the blockade of the southeast of the Mississippi River. All right, almost done. Now, in May of 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman, who took over for Grant when Grant moved east, launches a campaign against Atlanta, and this was done in tandem with Grant's overland campaign in Virginia. Now, the goal was to make sure that the Union forces could capture Atlanta, but also further divide the Confederacy. Again, back to the Anaconda Plan we talked at the beginning of the previous lecture. They're slowly splitting up the Confederacy. Now, Sherman launches attacks to push the Southern commander, Joseph Johnston, back towards Atlanta. Now, Johnston is smart. He fights a series of defensive actions back to the city, in particular New Hope Church, Kennesaw Mountain, as well as several others. But it's slow going, and he's retreating. Now, this leads us to Atlanta itself. Now, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, is upset with Johnston because he thinks that since he's retreating and fighting defensive actions, that he's not actually going to defend the city of Atlanta. So he replaces him with John Bell Hood because he wants a more aggressive commander in the defense of the city. Now, Hood, he actually attacks at a place called Peachtree Creek. It fails, and then over the next few weeks, he's going to fail in several aggressive attacks against Sherman's forces. And then ultimately his supply lines are cut, so he has to abandon the city. As he abandons the city, he sets fire to all of the military supplies in the city, damages a significant portion of the city, but it's a Union victory. And this is important because it means that the South is again further split up, and it's a capture of really one of their last major supply and transportation depots that they had control of. All right. The Tennessee campaign, which lasted between September and December of 1864. In this campaign, Hood, who had abandoned Atlanta, goes north into Tennessee, and he's trying to defeat Sherman by attacking his rear. But what Sherman does is he splits his forces. He continues with the main part of his army and sends George Thomas to deal with Hood. And in late November, the Union forces actually, at the Battle of Spring Hill, slip a trap that Hood had laid for them. And then the next day, Hood turns and then at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee assaults against prepared defenses, and his army is almost completely crushed. Now 2 weeks later, after it recovers a little bit, Thomas again at the city of Nashville meets up against Hood's forces and soundly defeats him and basically just kills his army there, and Hood is forced to retreat to Mississippi. Now these victories are important because this means that the Union now have completely captured Tennessee. All right, almost done. Sherman's march to the sea. After his conquest of Atlanta, Sherman decides that he's going to march to the Atlantic coast. And over the next couple of months, the goal is twofold. One, further split the Confederacy like they had been doing before. And two, destroy all of the resources that are helpful to his enemy. And he uses a policy called scorched earth, where he destroys everything. They burn anything that has military value. They destroy rail lines and so forth. They use what's called total war. Now, towards Christmas, Sherman captures Savannah, Georgia, which was the significant port city for Georgia on the Atlantic coast, which means that he gets to the coast. Now, this means that fighting in the Western Theater is, for all intents and purposes, effectively over, and he turns north by convincing Grant that he wants to go up through the Carolinas, mop up resistance, and do the exact same thing he did on the march to the sea. All right, last slide. This is the end of the fighting in the Western Theater. Sherman turns north. He continues to do the same thing that he did on his march to the sea through South Carolina. He captures Columbia, which is the capital of the city, and that's our capital of the state, which is important because South Carolina was the first state to secede. Now the city is burned, and it's debatable really who burned the city, if it was by accident, Confederates or the Northern forces. Now Johnston was in command of the Confederate forces facing these attacks, and he tries to break out by attacking Sherman at Bentonville, North Carolina. It fails, and then he has to further retreat back to Raleigh, the capital of North Carolina. Now at this point, Johnston actually meets with Sherman and signs an armistice. Now the armistice is on the 18th of April, but Sherman promises things that as a military commander he can't, so the formal surrender doesn't happen until the 26th of April, when it's just based on military reasons. And that, everybody, ends the war in the West.